Hey, this is Ben, and I want to come to you today talking about prayer. Now, a lot of Christians will tell you that prayer is how they know that God's real, and it's very common. And what I want to do is attempt to analyze this question a little bit. Because for a lot of non-believers, for a lot of atheists, this is their number one opposition. For a lot of them, they say this is the dumbest thing they've ever heard. Because the way prayer works is what Jesus said in Matthew 7 is, God's like our Father. He loves us and He does things for us because He loves us, not because we earned it and not because, He's not here to destroy us or anything, but that He cares about us, but at the same time, He's going to do what's best for us. And so the issue is, well, when you pray for something and you ask specifically, God, I want this to happen. And the idea is, God wants you to give you the desires of your heart. Tell Him what you really want, right? But the thing is, if God doesn't do it, Christians say, well, it wasn't God's will. And then if God does it, you say, oh, that proves that God exists because He answered my prayer. And the way, and look what I prayed for, and that exact thing happened. But then when it doesn't happen, that means that, well, that just wasn't God's will that time. So a lot of atheists come back at us and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You've just adjusted everything so that anything that happens proves that God answers your prayer, and there's no, this is meaningless. This is like saying, I know what rabbits always eat. And you say, well, what do rabbits always eat? Well, they always eat carrots unless they eat something else. So I have a theory that perfectly predicts whatever, rabbits eat. It's just so general that it can't be disproven, but it's also meaningless. In other words, the atheist would say, your concept of God who does exactly what you tell him to, except whenever he doesn't, he may just not do what you tell him to at all, is no different from no God at all. Now, the thing is, the argument I want to make to you today is that prayer can prove that God exists, but that it may be perhaps the most difficult way to prove that God exists. Because essentially, for you to use prayer as a way to determine that God exists, what you would have to do is to have a lot of insight into what God's plan is or would be. So you would have to really have like a knitting of the spirits with God to start seeing everything's going according to His plan. That means you have to have an idea of what His plan is and what He really intends, and you would have to know God really well. You and God would have to be really close. And if you understood and knew God, and you had a really tight knitting of the spirits between you and God, then you could start to see that, I see a lot of things, not absolutely everything, because you're not God, but a lot of things really are fitting into a plan. Now, of course, you can't, fully understand God, so you can't fully understand God's plan, so there would always have to be some things that, you just don't make any sense to you, because if it wasn't that way, then you would be God, if everything, you saw how everything makes sense. Now, but the point I want to make is, I think a lot of Christians throw this out there, I know God's real because He answers my prayers, and I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the easiest way to prove to yourself that God exists, because for that to work, you and God have to be like this. And it's a lot simpler sometimes actually to go through a logical proof for God's existence. They're not really that complicated or scary the way people get so scared of them. And so that's my point. I think a lot of Christians throw that out there, and it is nonsense from a lot of Christians because they will have to be really walking with the Lord super close, And I know that a lot of the time I'm not walking that close, and there's just no way everyone's just that super close with God. But for some people, it may totally super work, right? And so what I would say is it's actually easier to prove God exists, not through prayer, but through, the classical proofs for God's existence. People just are unfamiliar with them. They should have learned them when they were younger. So I hope that makes sense. I made this quick video today. Thank you for your time.